Sometimes people wonder how I managed to survive when most wouldn't. The truth is, when you've been betrayed by the very person who was supposed to protect you most in this world, you learn that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about finding the strength to reclaim your soul. Hello there, my dear ones. My name is Eleanor Mae Davidson, but everyone around here calls me Grandma Ellie. I'm 82 years old now, born in 1942 in a forgotten corner of rural Alabama called Millbrook Hollow. Today, I'm going to share with you a story I've kept buried in the deepest corners of my heart for over 70 years. A story about betrayal so profound it changed the very fabric of who I am. A story about darkness, but also about the light that eventually found its way through the cracks. This isn't just my story. It's a story for anyone who's ever felt completely alone in this world, anyone who's wondered if they could survive what seems impossible to survive. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Millbrook Hollow in 1942 wasn't even a dot on most maps. It was just a collection of weathered houses scattered along a dirt road, surrounded by cotton fields that stretched as far as a child's eyes could see. The Alabama heat was so thick in summer you could almost chew it, and the winters were cold enough to make your bones ache. But it was home, and for the first 8 years of my life, it felt safe. Our house sat at the end of Willow Creek Road, a modest structure with peeling white paint and a wraparound porch where my mother, Catherine, would sit in the evenings, shelling peas or mending clothes. The house had 3 small bedrooms, a kitchen that always smelled of cornbread and coffee, and a living room where my father, William Davidson, would read his newspaper by the light of our single lamp. My family seemed ordinary enough from the outside. Daddy worked at Morrison's lumber mill about 20 miles away, leaving before dawn each morning and returning after sunset with sawdust in his hair and the smell of pine on his clothes. Mama took care of me and my baby sister Ruth, who was only 3 years old when this story begins. We weren't rich by any means, but we had enough. Enough food on the table, enough wood for the fireplace, enough love to make our small world feel complete. I remember those early years with a clarity that surprises me even now. The way Mama would hum while she cooked breakfast, usually grits and eggs from our own chickens. The sound of Daddy's work boots on the wooden porch steps when he came home. The way little Ruth would giggle when I made faces at her during Sunday. Church services at Millbrook Baptist, where Reverend Harris would preach about God's love and protection. Daddy seemed different then, or maybe I was too young to see the signs that were already there. He was a tall man, over 6 feet, with broad shoulders from years of manual labor. His hands were always rough and calloused, but when he'd pick me up and spin me around in the front yard, they felt gentle. He had dark brown hair that he kept, slicked back with pomade, and eyes the color of storm clouds, gray-blue and sometimes hard to read. William Davidson was respected in our small community. He was the kind of man other men nodded to at the general store, the kind who got asked to help when someone needed to raise a barn or fix a roof. He had a reputation for being reliable, hard-working, and fair in his dealings. Nobody would have suspected what darkness lived beneath that respected exterior. Mama was everything good and pure in my young world. Catherine Rose Davidson had been Catherine Rose Miller before she married Daddy, and she came from a family of schoolteachers 3 counties over. She had finished high school, which was more education than most women in Millbrook Hollow had, and she could read and write beautifully. She taught me my letters and numbers before I was old enough for school, sitting with me at our kitchen table with a piece of slate and chalk she'd saved from her own school days. She was petite, maybe 5 feet 2 inches tall, with auburn hair that she wore in soft waves around her face. Her eyes were the warmest brown I've ever seen, like melted chocolate, and when she smiled, which was often in those days, her whole face would light up. Mama had a way of making everything feel special. She could turn a simple afternoon of hanging laundry into an adventure by making up stories about where the wind was taking our clothes to dance. Our daily routine was simple but comforting. Mornings began before sunrise with Mama starting the fire and putting coffee on to boil. The smell would drift into the bedroom I shared with Ruth, waking us naturally. I'd help Mama with breakfast while Ruth played with her corn husk doll that Mama had made for her. After Daddy left for work, we'd spend our days doing household chores, tending to our small garden, and taking care of the chickens. In the evenings, after supper, we'd sit on the porch if the weather was nice. Daddy would whittle small toys from scraps of wood he brought home from the mill, creating little horses and birds that Ruth and I treasured. Mama would sew or darn socks, and sometimes she'd tell us stories her own grandmother had told her, tales of brave princesses and magical forests that seemed to exist in a world far removed from our simple life in Alabama. Sundays were special. We'd dress in our best clothes. I had a blue dress with white collar that Mama had sewn for me, and Ruth had a yellow one that made her look like a little sunflower. We'd walk the half-mile to Millbrook Baptist Church, where the entire community gathered. After service, there would often be potluck dinners on the church grounds, with tables groaning under the weight of fried chicken, cornbread, sweet potato pie, and all manner of Southern cooking. It was at these church gatherings that I first noticed Harold Brennan. He was Daddy's closest friend, a man who seemed to always be around our family. Harold was shorter than Daddy, maybe 5'8", but stockier, with thick arms and a barrel chest. He had thinning brown hair that he combed over a growing bald spot, and small, dark eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. He never married, which wasn't unusual for men in those days, especially during the Depression years that had just passed. Harold worked alongside Daddy at Morrison's lumber mill, and the two men had known each other since they were boys growing up in adjacent counties. Harold would often come to our house for Sunday dinner, and sometimes he'd stay late into the evening sitting on our porch with Daddy, smoking hand-rolled cigarettes and talking about work, weather, and local news. Looking back now with the wisdom of age and painful experience, I can see things I missed then. The way Harold's eyes would follow me when I played in the yard. How he always seemed to have a reason to touch my shoulder or pat my head when he spoke to me. The way conversations would stop when I entered a room where he and Daddy were talking. But I was 8 years old, innocent and trusting, seeing only what a child sees, a friend of the family who brought peppermint sticks from town and always had a kind word for me and Ruth. Harold lived alone in a cabin about 2 miles down the creek from our house. It was a rough place, just 2 rooms with a stone chimney and windows that were often covered with oilcloth instead of glass. He kept to himself mostly, except for his friendship with Daddy and his regular presence at our Sunday dinners. People in Millbrook Hollow thought of him as a harmless bachelor, a little odd maybe, but reliable and hardworking. The change in our family began so gradually that I didn't notice it at first. It started with Daddy coming home later from work, often smelling of something stronger than the beer he occasionally drank. His mood would be different, sometimes overly cheerful in a way that felt forced, other times sullen and distant. Mama would get that worried look on her face, the one where she'd bite her lower lip and her forehead would crease with lines. Money became a frequent topic of hushed conversations between my parents. I'd hear fragments: behind on the rent, mill cutting back hours, don't know how we'll manage. The Depression had ended, but its effects still lingered in places like Millbrook Hollow, where opportunities were scarce and families lived paycheck to paycheck. It was during this time of growing tension that Harold's visits became more frequent. He'd show up not just on Sundays, but on weekday evenings, always with some excuse. He'd brought vegetables from his garden, or he wanted to borrow a tool, or he'd heard about work opportunities he wanted to discuss with Daddy. These visits always seemed to cheer Daddy up, and I remember feeling grateful that our family friend was helping to ease whatever burdens were weighing on my father's shoulders. What I didn't understand then was that those private conversations between Daddy and Harold weren't about work or weather or neighborly concerns. They were negotiations. discussions about value and price and arrangements that would forever shatter the safe world I'd known. Harold wasn't just visiting our family. He was studying us, evaluating us, making plans that would reveal the true nature of both men. The last normal day of my childhood was a Tuesday in October 1950. I remember it so clearly because it was the day before everything changed forever. Mama had made apple butter from fruit we'd picked in the abandoned orchard behind our house. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon and autumn, and Ruth was helping by standing on a chair next to the stove, stirring the pot with a wooden spoon almost as big as she was. Daddy came home that evening with news that he'd been laid off from the mill. The lumber business was slowing down, he explained, and they were letting some of the workers go. But instead of seeming worried, he appeared almost relieved, which struck me as strange. He assured Mama that it would be temporary, that Harold had some ideas about other work they could do together. That night, as I lay in my small bed next to Ruth, listening to my parents talking in low voices in the next room, I had no idea that it would be the last night I'd sleep safely in my own home. I had no idea that my father had already made a decision that would trade away my childhood, my innocence, and nearly my life for money that would solve his immediate problems, but create ones far worse than any financial difficulty could ever be. Tomorrow would bring a betrayal so complete, so devastating, that it would take me decades to understand how a father could do such a thing to his own child. Tomorrow would begin a nightmare that would test every ounce of strength I didn't even know I possessed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning of October 18th, 1950 started like any other Wednesday, but the air felt different somehow. Heavier, like before a thunderstorm. I woke to the usual sounds of Mama starting breakfast, but when I padded barefoot into the kitchen, I noticed she was moving slower than usual, her shoulders tense with worry. "Morning, Mama," I said, climbing onto my usual chair at our wooden table. Ruth was still asleep, curled up like a little kitten in our shared bed. "Morning, sweet pea," Mama replied, but her voice lacked its usual warmth. She was stirring a pot of grits with one hand while wiping her eyes with her apron. Daddy's already gone to town. Said he had some business to take care of." Even at 8 years old, I could sense something was wrong. Daddy never left for business. He either went to work at the mill or he stayed home. And with the mill laying him off, where could he possibly need to go so early in the morning? The day dragged on strangely. Mama seemed distracted, jumping at every small sound. The chickens clucking in the yard, the wind rattling our loose window pane, even my footsteps on the wooden floor. She kept looking out the front window, watching the dirt road that led to our house as if she expected something to happen. Around noon, while Ruth and I were playing with our corn-husk dolls on the front porch, we saw a dust cloud approaching down the road. It was Daddy's old Ford pickup truck, but he wasn't alone. Harold Brennan sat in the passenger seat, and there was someone else in the truck bed. Another man I didn't recognize. The truck pulled up to our house, and all three men got out. The stranger was tall and thin, with greasy black hair and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. His face was pockmarked and weathered, and when he smiled at me, I noticed several of his teeth were missing. Something about him made my skin crawl, like seeing a snake coiled in the grass. "Catherine!" Daddy called out as he approached the porch. "Come on out here! We need to talk!" Mama emerged from the house, drying her hands on her apron. I could see her hands shaking. "William, what's all this about? Who's this man?" "This here's Ezra Polk," Daddy said, gesturing to the stranger. "He's got a proposition that's gonna solve all our problems." Harold stepped forward, that familiar false smile on his face. "Eleanor, Ruth, why don't you girls go inside and play? The grown-ups need to have a talk." But I didn't want to go inside. Something felt terribly wrong about this whole situation. The way the three men stood together, The way Mama's face had gone pale as sheet. The way this stranger, Ezra, kept looking at me with those cold, calculating eyes. "Eleanor, go on now," Daddy said, his voice carrying a tone I'd never heard before, hard and final. "Take your sister and stay in your room until we're done talking." Reluctantly, I took Ruth's hand and led her inside. But instead of going to our bedroom, I crept to the kitchen window where I could hear the conversation on the porch. Ruth sat on the floor playing with her doll, oblivious to the tension that filled the air like smoke. "You sure about this, William?" I heard Mama ask, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's just a baby. She's only 8 years old." "Catherine, we're gonna lose the house," Daddy replied, his voice strained. "The bank's gonna foreclose next month. We owe money to half the town. This is the only way." "There has to be another way," Mama pleaded. "We could move in with my sister in Birmingham. I could get work as a seamstress. Please, William, don't do this." "Your sister's got her own family to worry about," Daddy said firmly. "And nobody's gonna hire a woman when there's men out of work. This is temporary, Catherine. Just until I can get back on my feet." Harold's voice joined the conversation then, smooth and persuasive. "Mrs. Davidson, Ezra here runs a boarding house for working girls over in Montgomery. Eleanor would be well cared for, earn good money, and send most of it back home to help the family. It's really an opportunity for her." My blood ran cold. A boarding house for working girls? Even at 8, I knew enough about the world to understand that wasn't anything good. I'd heard whispered conversations between the women at church about such places, and the way they shook their heads and looked sad when they talked about girls who ended up there. "How much?" Mama asked, and I could hear tears in her voice. $200 now, Ezra spoke for the first time, his voice raspy like sandpaper. "And $50 a month after that, as long as she's productive. $200. It was more money than our family saw in 6 months. Enough to pay off the bank, buy food for months, maybe even get Daddy a new start somewhere else. But the price was me. And she'll be safe?" Mama's voice was breaking. "You swear she'll be safe and treated well?" "Safe as houses," Harold assured her. But there was something in his tone that made my stomach turn. "I'll be checking on her regular-like, making sure everything's proper." I realized then what was happening. Harold hadn't just been visiting our family as a friend. He'd been planning this, arranging this, probably for months. All those conversations with Daddy about money troubles, all those measuring looks he'd given me. He'd been setting this up from the beginning. "When?" Daddy asked, and I heard resignation in his voice. The deal was already done in his mind. "Today," Ezra replied. "No sense in waiting. I've got a truck. She can ride with me back to Montgomery. We'll get her settled, start her working. Tomorrow." Working. The word hit me like a physical blow. What kind of work did 8-year-old girls do at boarding houses for working girls? Deep down, I already knew the answer, but my mind refused to accept it. "I need to pack her things," Mama said, and I could hear footsteps approaching the door. I scrambled away from the window and grabbed Ruth, pulling her toward our bedroom just as Mama came inside. Her face was streaked with tears, but she was trying to be strong. "Eleanor, baby, come here," she said, kneeling down to my level. "Mama needs to talk to you about something important." I looked into her eyes, those warm brown eyes that had always made me feel safe, and saw desperation there. And something else. Guilt so deep it seemed to be eating her alive from the inside. "You're going to go away for a while," she began, her voice carefully controlled. "To help a nice man who runs a place where girls can work and earn money for their families." "I don't want to go away, Mama," I said, fear making my voice small and shaky. "I want to stay here with you and Ruth and Daddy." "I know, sweet pea." "I know," she whispered, pulling me into a hug that felt like goodbye. "But sometimes we have to do things we don't want to do to help the people we love. Your daddy's out of work, and we owe money to some people who might take our house away if we can't pay them." "Can't Ruth and I both go?" I asked, though I didn't really want to leave at all. "No, baby. Ruth's too little. It's just you for now. But you're my brave girl, aren't you? You're strong and smart, and you're going to help save our family." The weight of that responsibility, saving our family, settled on my 8-year-old shoulders like a mountain. How could I refuse when Mama and Daddy were counting on me? How could I be selfish when Ruth needed a home and food? Mama packed my few belongings in a small cardboard suitcase: my other dress, my Sunday shoes, my hairbrush, and the small wooden horse Daddy had carved for me last Christmas. She also tucked in a photograph of our family taken at church last Easter and a letter she wrote quickly while tears dripped onto the paper. "You keep this letter," she said, pressing it into my hands. "And you remember that Mama loves you more than all the stars in the sky. No matter what happens, no matter how long you're gone, you remember that you're my precious girl, and I will never stop loving you." When we came back outside, the 3 men were standing by Ezra's truck. Harold had a small bag of money in his hand, my price. $200 in crumpled bills that would save our house and damn my soul. "You be a good girl, Eleanor," Daddy said, but he couldn't look me in the eyes. "Do what Mr. Polk tells you, work hard, and send money home to help your mama and sister." He didn't hug me goodbye. He didn't even touch me. Years later, I would understand that he couldn't, because touching me in that moment would have made real what he was doing. It would have made him face the truth that he was selling his own daughter to men he knew weren't going to use her for any kind of honest work. Harold lifted me into the back of Ezra's truck like I was a sack of grain. "Don't you worry none, Eleanor," he said with that false smile. "Uncle Harold's gonna take real good care of you." The word uncle made my skin crawl. Harold wasn't my uncle. He was something much worse. He was the spider who had spun this web, the predator who had convinced my desperate father that selling his daughter was the solution to financial problems. As the truck pulled away from our house, I turned to look, back at my family. Mama was crying openly now, clutching Ruth to her chest. Ruth was waving, too young to understand that her big sister was disappearing, possibly forever. Daddy stood with his hands in his pockets, his head down, unable or unwilling to watch his daughter being driven away. The drive to Montgomery took 3 hours on dusty back roads. Ezra didn't speak to me during the trip, just occasionally glanced back to make sure I was still there. I clutched Mama's letter and the family photograph, trying to be brave like she'd asked me to be. But inside, I was terrified. Harold had ridden, in the truck cab with Ezra, and I could see them talking, but I couldn't hear what they were saying over the engine noise and wind. Sometimes Harold would turn and look at me, and each time he did, that false smile would spread across his face like oil on water. As we approached Montgomery, the landscape changed from rural farmland to something grittier and more urban. The buildings were taller, the streets were paved, and there were more people than I'd ever seen in one place. But instead of excitement at seeing a big city for the first time, I felt only dread. The truck finally stopped in front of a 3-story wooden building that looked like it had seen better days. The paint was peeling, several windows were boarded up, and there was a strange smell in the air, a mixture of cheap perfume, cigarette smoke, and something else I couldn't identify, but instinctively knew was wrong. "Welcome to your new home. Little Eleanor," Harold said as he helped me down from the truck. "This is where you're gonna learn how to be useful." The way he said useful made my stomach turn. I was 8 years old, standing in front of a building that looked like it belonged in a nightmare, holding a cardboard suitcase and a letter from my mama, about to discover what my father's desperation and Harold's greed had truly bought. The building that would become my prison stood before me like a monster with broken teeth, its boarded windows creating gaps in what should have been a welcoming facade. A faded sign hung crooked above the entrance. Magnolia House, rooms available. But there was nothing beautiful about this place, despite its flowery name. Ezra grabbed my small suitcase with one grimy hand and my arm with the other, his fingers digging into my flesh like claws. "Come on, girl. Time to meet the lady of the house." Harold walked beside us, no longer bothering with his fake friendliness now that we were far from Millbrook Hollow. His true nature was beginning to show, cold, calculating, like a businessman, inspecting merchandise he'd just purchased. The front door opened before we reached it, as if someone had been watching from inside. A woman stepped out onto the sagging porch, and my first sight of Vivian Cartwright is burned into my memory like a brand. She was tall and thin, probably in her 40s, with bleached blonde hair piled high on her head and held in place with enough hairspray to shellac a table. Her dress was bright red and too tight, and she wore more makeup than all the women in Millbrook Hollow combined. But it was her eyes that frightened me most. They were pale blue, almost colorless, and completely empty of warmth or kindness. When she looked at me, I felt like a piece of livestock being evaluated at auction. "Well, well," she said, her voice carrying a slight northern accent that sounded out of place in Alabama. "So this is the little angel Harold's been telling me about. 8 years old, you said?" "Just turned 8 last month," Harold confirmed, pushing me forward slightly. "Fresh as morning dew and twice as sweet. Should bring in good money once she's properly trained." Trained? The word made my stomach lurch. Trained for what? Vivian circled around me slowly, examining me from every angle. She lifted my chin with one long red fingernail, tilted my head this way and that, even checked my teeth like I was a horse she might buy. The whole inspection made me feel dirty, like something crawling under my skin. "She's pretty enough," Vivian concluded. "Good bone structure, nice coloring. The customers will like that innocent look." She paused, then added with a cruel smile, "For now, anyway." "What about the money?" Ezra asked impatiently. "Harold said you'd have the rest of the payment. Business first, then pleasure," Vivian replied, leading us into the building. "Let me show our new girl to her quarters, then we'll settle accounts." The inside of Magnolia House was even worse than the outside. The wallpaper was stained and peeling, the floors were warped and creaky, and that strange smell I'd noticed. Outside was much stronger here, a nauseating mixture of cheap perfume, tobacco, unwashed bodies, and something sour that made me want to gag. As we walked through what had once been a parlor, I saw other girls for the first time. They ranged in age from maybe 12 to 20, all dressed in thin, revealing clothing that left little to the imagination. Some lounged on worn furniture, staring at nothing with dead eyes. Others moved around like ghosts, cleaning or carrying trays. None of them looked at me directly, as if acknowledging my presence would make my fate, and theirs, more real. One girl, maybe 14 with stringy brown hair, caught my eye for just a moment. In that brief glance, I saw a flash of pity mixed with something else, a warning. She quickly looked away, but her message was clear. Run if you can. But where could I run? I was in a strange city, miles from home, with no money and no way to get back. I was trapped as surely as if they'd put chains on my ankles. Vivian led us up a narrow staircase to the second floor, down a hallway lined with doors. Most were closed, but from behind some came sounds that made my young mind recoil. Muffled voices, creaking bed springs, occasional laughter that sounded forced and hollow. "This will be your room," Vivian announced, opening a door near the end of the hall. The room was tiny, barely large enough for the single bed, washstand, and small dresser it contained. A window looked out onto an alley, but it was barred from the outside. The walls were thin. I could hear everything happening in the adjacent rooms. "It's not much," Vivian continued. "But then again, you won't be spending much time here during working hours. Now let's talk about the rules." She sat on the edge of the bed while Harold and Ezra stood by the door, blocking any possible escape. I remained standing, clutching my suitcase, trying to process what was happening to me. Rule number 1. Vivian began, counting on her fingers. You do exactly what you're told. When you're told, no questions asked. Rule number 2. You never try to leave this house without permission. The doors are locked, the windows are barred, and I have friends who would be very unhappy if one of my girls went missing. Rule number 3. You give me every penny you earn. I'll keep track of what you owe for room and board, which is considerable. And when you've paid off your debt, we'll talk about you earning a little spending money. My debt? What debt? I was 8 years old. What could I possibly owe? Rule number 4, she continued, her voice growing harder. You keep your mouth shut about what goes on here. The customers value their privacy, and so do I. Anyone who talks too much about our business tends to disappear. Permanently. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Even at my young age, I understood she was talking about murder. Girls who caused trouble simply vanished, never to be seen again. Now then, Vivian stood up, smoothing her tight dress. Let's discuss your training schedule. You'll start tomorrow morning with Dolores. She'll teach you how to present yourself properly, how to move, how to speak to customers. By next week, you should be ready for your first assignment. Assignment. The word made my blood run cold. I still didn't fully understand what kind of work I was expected to do, but every instinct I had screamed that it was something terrible. Harold spoke up from the doorway. I'll be checking on her regular-like, making sure everything's going smooth. The arrangement was that I get a percentage of her earnings for bringing her in. Of course, Vivian agreed. 20%, as we discussed. You'll get your cut every month, provided she's performing satisfactorily. They were talking about me like I wasn't even there, like I was a thing to be bought and sold and used. The reality of my situation was starting to sink in. My own father had sold me to these people, and Harold was going to profit from whatever they forced me to do. I want to go home, I said suddenly, my voice small but desperate. Please, I want to see my mama. Vivian laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Home? Sweetheart, this is your home now. Your daddy sold you fair and square, signed papers and everything. You belong to me now, at least until you work off what you owe. I don't owe anything, I protested, tears starting to flow. I'm just a little girl. I want my mama. The slap came so fast I didn't see it coming. Vivian's hand cracked across my face with enough force to knock me sideways. My cheek burned, and I tasted blood where my teeth had cut the inside of my mouth. Rule number 5, she said coldly. No crying, no whining, no feeling sorry for yourself. The customers don't want to hear it, and neither do I. You're here to work, not to be a baby. Harold was smiling now, enjoying my pain and fear. Better. Get used to it, little Eleanor. This is your life now. Might as well make the best of it. As if to emphasize the hopelessness of my situation, Ezra stepped forward and handed Vivian a roll of bills. Here's the rest of the money for the girl, $200 up front, like we agreed. Pleasure doing business with you boys, Vivian said, counting the money quickly. Harold, you know where to find me when you want to collect your percentage. Ezra, thanks for the delivery. Doors always open if you find any more merchandise. Merchandise. That's all I was to them. A product to be bought, sold, and used until I was worn out and worthless. The weight of that realization settled on my small shoulders like a stone. After the men left, Vivian turned her attention back to me. Her fake pleasantness was completely gone now, replaced by cold business efficiency. Strip, she ordered. What? I stammered, not understanding. Take off your clothes. I need to inspect what I bought, make sure there are no diseases or defects that weren't mentioned. The humiliation was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Standing naked in that cold room while this terrible woman examined every inch of my body like I was livestock made me feel less than human. She poked and prodded, checking for things I didn't understand, making notes on a piece of paper. Good muscle tone, she muttered to herself. No obvious health problems. Skin's clear, should photograph well. She looked up at me with those cold, empty eyes. You'll do just fine, little girl. The younger ones always bring premium prices. Nye handed me a thin cotton dress from the dresser, faded pink with a torn hem. Put this on. Tomorrow you start your training. Dolores will teach you everything you need to know. That first night in Magnolia House was the longest of my young life. I lay on the narrow bed, still wearing Mama's letter pressed against my chest, listening to the sounds coming through the thin walls. Voices, footsteps, doors opening and closing, and other sounds that my innocent mind couldn't yet interpret, but somehow knew were wrong. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw Daddy's face as he counted Harold's money. I saw Mama crying on the porch, holding Ruth. I wondered if they were thinking about me, if they missed me, if they had any idea what they'd really sent me to. Around midnight, I heard my door open quietly. A figure slipped inside. It was the girl with stringy brown hair who had looked at me earlier. She approached my bed cautiously, like she was afraid of making noise. "My name's Alice," she whispered, sitting on the edge of my bed. "I've been here 2 years. Came when I was 12. "I want to go home," I whispered back, tears starting again despite Vivian's warning. "We all want to go home," Alice replied sadly. "But there ain't no going home from this place. The sooner you accept that, the easier it'll be." "What kind of work do they make us do?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. Alice was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. "Men come, here. They pay money to be with us, to do things to us. Tomorrow, Dolores will start teaching you how to act, how to please them, how to make them want to come back." The room seemed to spin around me. Even at 8, I understood enough about the world to know what she was describing. The boarding house wasn't for working girls in any respectable sense. It was a brothel, and I was going to be forced to service the men who came here looking for children to abuse. "I can't," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I won't do it." Alice reached out and took my hand. Her fingers were thin and cold, like a ghost's touch. "You will," she said simply. "Because if you don't, they'll hurt you until you do. And if you still refuse, they'll kill you and find another girl to take your place." She stood up to leave, but paused at the door. "Try to go somewhere else in your mind when it happens," she advised. "Pretend you're back home, or in a pretty field, or anywhere but here. It's the only way to survive." After she left, I lay in the darkness, holding Mama's letter and staring at the barred window. Outside, I could see stars, the same stars that shone over Millbrook Hollow, over the little house where Ruth was probably sleeping peacefully in our old bed. I made a promise to myself that night, a promise that would sustain me through the horrors to come. Somehow, some way I would escape this place. I would find a way back to my family or die trying. I was just 8 years old, but I had already learned that sometimes dying was preferable to living without hope. What I didn't know was that my real education was just beginning, and the lessons I would learn in the coming days would test every ounce of strength and cunning I possessed. The men who bought and sold me thought they had broken my spirit before it even had a chance to grow strong. They were wrong. Dawn crept through the barred window of my tiny room like a thief, bringing with it the terrible realization that my nightmare at Magnolia House was only beginning. I had barely slept, my mind spinning with Alice's warnings and the horrifying truth of what this place really was. The sounds from other rooms had continued through the night. Footsteps in the hallway, muffled voices, doors opening and closing until the early morning hours. A sharp knock on my door jolted me fully awake. "Get up, new girl," came a raspy voice. From the hallway. "Training starts in 10 minutes. I scrambled to put on the faded pink dress Vivian had given me, my hands shaking as I tried to make myself presentable. The dress was too big, hanging loosely on my small frame, and smelled like it hadn't been washed properly in months. When I opened the door, I found a woman waiting for me in the hallway. This had to be Dolores. She was somewhere in her 30s, with dark hair streaked with premature gray and pulled back in a severe bun. Her face might have been pretty once, but years of hard living had carved deep lines around her eyes and mouth. She wore a simple brown dress and an expression of weary resignation that spoke of dreams long dead. "I'm Dolores Martinez," she said, looking me up and down with a mixture of pity and professional assessment. "Vivian says I'm to teach you the ropes. Come with me." She led me downstairs to a room I hadn't seen the day before, a parlor that had been converted into what looked like a twisted version of a finishing school classroom. There were mirrors on the walls, a piano in one corner, and several chairs arranged in a circle. The morning light streaming through the windows made the shabby furniture look even more depressing. "Sit down," Dolores instructed, pointing to one of the chairs. First lesson, posture. A lady always sits with her back straight, her hands folded in her lap and her ankles crossed. Never spread your legs like a farm girl. I did as she said, trying to sit the way she described. It felt unnatural and uncomfortable, but Dolores nodded approvingly. "Good. Now, let's talk about what you're going to learn here." She sat across from me, her voice taking on the tone of a teacher, though the subject matter was anything but educational. "You're going to learn how to walk gracefully, how to speak softly and pleasantly, how to make conversation with gentlemen, and how to make them feel special and important." Gentlemen? The word made my stomach turn. I knew these weren't real gentlemen. They were men who paid money to hurt children. "Why are you here?" I asked suddenly, the question bursting out before I could stop myself. "You're a grown-up. Can't you just leave?" Dolores's expression darkened, and for a moment, I saw a flash of the pain she carried. "Same reason you're here, little girl. Someone sold me when I was young, and by the time I was old enough to understand what had happened to me, I had nowhere else to go. This is all I know now." She stood up and walked to one of the mirrors, staring at her reflection with undisguised hatred. "I used to dream of leaving, of finding a nice man who would marry me and give me a normal life. But what kind of man wants a woman like me? What kind of life could I have out there?" The hopelessness in her voice was terrifying. Was this my future? Would I end up like Dolores, trapped in this place not just by locked doors and barred windows, but by the belief that I was too damaged for anything better? "Now," she continued, turning back to me with forced briskness, "let's practice walking. Stand up and walk to that mirror and back, but slowly. Imagine you're balancing a book on your head." For the next hour, Dolores put me through a series of exercises designed to change everything about how I moved and carried myself. "Walk slower," she'd say. "Smaller steps. Keep your shoulders back. Smile even when you don't feel like it, especially when you don't feel like it." It was during these lessons that I began to understand the true horror of what they were doing to me. They weren't just planning to abuse my body. They were systematically destroying who I was and rebuilding me into something else entirely. Every natural gesture, every childish habit, every trace of the little girl I had been was to be erased and replaced with a performance designed to please predators. "Now we're going to practice conversation," Dolores announced, sitting back down. "Rule number 1, always let the gentleman lead the conversation. Ask him about himself, his work, his interests, his family. Men love to talk about themselves." The irony was sickening. I was being taught to show interest in the personal lives of men who were going to assault me. I was supposed to care about their families while they destroyed mine. "What if I don't want to talk to them?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Dolores's face hardened. "Then you'll learn to want to. Vivian has ways of making girls more cooperative. Trust me, You don't want to find out what those ways are. As if summoned by her name, Vivian appeared in the doorway. She was wearing a different dress today, purple silk that probably cost more than my family's house, but her cold eyes were the same. "How's our new student doing?" she asked, her voice sickeningly sweet. "She's learning," Dolores replied carefully. "A bit resistant, but that's normal for the first day." Vivian approached me, circling my chair like a shark. "Resistance is natural, Eleanor, but it's also pointless. You can make this easy on yourself, or you can make it hard. Either way, you're going to do what I tell you to do." She leaned down until her face was level with mine, and I could smell her heavy perfume mixed with cigarette smoke. "Do you know what happens to girls who don't cooperate?" I shook my head, too frightened to speak. "Come with me," she said, grabbing my arm and pulling me to my feet. "I think it's time you met someone." Vivian dragged me upstairs, past my room, to a door at the far end of the hallway. She unlocked it with a key from her pocket and pushed it open. The smell that hit me was overwhelming. Unwashed bodies, sickness, and something worse I couldn't identify. In the corner of the small, windowless room sat a girl who couldn't have been much older than me. Her hair was matted and dirty, her face was covered in bruises, and her eyes were completely empty, like looking into a well, with no bottom. "This is what happens to girls who cause too much trouble," Vivian said casually, as if she were showing me a piece of furniture. "Sarah here used to fight every customer, scream, bite, make all sorts of fuss. So I had to break her of those bad habits." The girl, Sarah, didn't react to hearing her name. She just sat there, rocking slightly back and forth, staring at nothing. "What did you do to her?" I whispered, horrified. "Oh, nothing permanent," Vivian replied with a cruel smile. "Just helped her understand her place. A few weeks in here with nothing but bread and water, some special medicine to help her relax, and some intensive training sessions with my most creative customers. Now she's very well behaved." I felt sick. This broken shell of a girl was what Vivian considered success. This was what awaited me if I didn't submit completely to their demands. "She's perfect now," Vivian continued, running her fingers through Sarah's matted hair. The girl didn't even flinch. "Never complains, never fights, does exactly what she's told. Very popular with certain customers who like their girls quiet and obedient." The message was clear: cooperate or be destroyed. Submit or end up like Sarah, a living corpse who no longer had the will to resist or even react. We returned to the parlor, where Dolores was waiting with obvious anxiety. She knew what Vivian had shown me, probably had seen other girls taken to that room over the years. "Now then," Vivian said, settling into a chair like she was attending a tea party, "I think Eleanor has a better understanding of her situation. Shall we continue her education?" The rest of the morning was a blur of degrading lessons. Dolores taught me how to apply makeup, not the subtle rouge that respectable women wore, but heavy, garish paint designed to make me look older and more available. She showed me how to fix my hair in styles that were supposed to be alluring, though they just made me look like a child playing dress-up in the worst possible way. The most horrifying part was the clothing lesson. Vivian brought down several outfits, if they could be called that. Thin cotton dresses that barely covered my knees, shirts that were too small and transparent, and undergarments that seemed designed more for display than for wearing. "Presentation is everything," Vivian explained as she held up a particularly revealing dress against my small frame. "The customers are paying good money, and they expect to see what they're buying." I tried on several of these outfits while both women critiqued my appearance like I was a mannequin in a store window. "Too loose here, too tight there. This color doesn't suit her complexion." They discussed my body like it belonged to them, which I suppose it now did. Around noon, Harold arrived for his first check-in. He knocked on the front door like a legitimate visitor, and Vivian welcomed him with false warmth. "How's our little investment doing?" he asked, settling into the parlor like he owned the place. Very well, Vivian replied. She's a quick learner. I think she'll be ready for light duty by next week. Light duty. The phrase made my blood freeze. What was heavy duty if there was such a thing as light duty in this place? Harold turned his attention to me, looking me up and down with obvious satisfaction. I was wearing one of the new outfits, a yellow dress that was shorter and tighter than anything I'd ever worn before. You look real pretty, Eleanor, he said, his voice carrying the same false kindness I remembered from our family dinners. Daddy would be proud to see how well you're doing. The mention of my father was like a physical blow. Would Daddy really be proud? Did he know what he'd really sent me to do? Or had he convinced himself that I was working in some respectable job, earning honest money to support the family? Has she been cooperative? Harold asked Vivian. Mostly. A few moments of resistance, but nothing I can't handle. Children are naturally adaptable. They were talking about me like I wasn't even there again, planning my future like business people discussing a profitable venture. Harold would get his percentage, Vivian would get her profits, and I would get whatever was left of my childhood systematically destroyed. That afternoon brought new horrors. Dolores introduced me to what she called customer service training, lessons in how to make men feel welcome and special. She taught me phrases to use, compliments to give, ways to touch that would seem affectionate rather than professional. The most sickening part was when she brought in one of the other girls to demonstrate. The girl, maybe 16, showed me how to sit on a man's lap, how to laugh at his jokes even if they weren't funny, how to act impressed by whatever he said about himself. Remember, Dolores instructed, the customer is always right. If he wants to talk, you listen. If he wants to play games, you play along. If he wants... She paused, looking at my young face. Well, you'll learn about that part later. As the day wore on, I began to understand the full scope of my situation. This wasn't just about being forced to do terrible things. It was about being reprogrammed to want to do them, or at least to convincingly pretend that I did. They were trying to kill Eleanor Davidson, the little girl from Millbrook Hollow, and replace her with something else entirely. But deep inside, in a place they couldn't reach with their lessons and threats and broken examples like Sarah, a small flame of defiance still burned. I would play their games for now, learn their rules, submit to their training, but I wouldn't let them destroy who I really was. I would survive this, and someday, somehow, I would make them pay for what they'd taken from me. The sun was setting outside the parlor windows when Vivian finally declared the training session over for the day. Tomorrow we'll continue, she announced, and by the end of the week, you should be ready for your first customer. As I was led back to my small room, those words echoed in my mind. Your first customer. In just a few days, some man would pay money to hurt me, and I would be expected to smile and pretend I enjoyed it. But they had made one crucial mistake in their eagerness to break me down and rebuild me. They had shown me Sarah, thinking her broken state would terrify me into submission. Instead, seeing what they were capable of had done something else entirely. It made me angry. And anger, I was beginning to learn, could be more powerful than fear. The second day of training began before sunrise with the sound of Vivian's heels clicking down the hallway like a death march. She didn't bother knocking. The door to my room flew open with a bang that made me bolt upright in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. Up and dressed in 5 minutes, she barked, tossing a bundle of clothes onto my bed. You have a special lesson today. The outfit she'd brought was different from the previous day's garments. A white cotton dress with blue ribbons that might have looked innocent on any other child, but felt sinister in this context. As I struggled into it with shaking hands, I noticed it had been altered to fit my small frame perfectly. Someone had taken the time to tailor it specifically for me, which somehow made everything feel more premeditated, more final. I was led downstairs to the kitchen, where I found Alice sitting at a scarred wooden table, mechanically spooning oatmeal into her mouth. She looked up when I entered, and I saw a flicker of something, pity, perhaps, or warning, cross her gaunt features before she quickly looked away. "Sit," Vivian commanded, pointing to a chair across from Alice. "Eat quickly. We have an important visitor coming this morning." The oatmeal tasted like paste, but I forced myself to swallow it anyway. I had learned already that refusing food would only bring punishment, and I needed to keep my strength up if I was ever going to find a way out of this nightmare. "Today," Vivian announced, settling into a chair with her morning coffee, "you're going to meet Dr. Cornelius Blackwood. He's what you might call a special friend of the house." Alice's spoon clattered against her bowl, and I saw her hands start to tremble. Whatever this Dr. Blackwood represented, it terrified her. "The doctor has very particular tastes," Vivian continued, stirring sugar into her coffee with deliberate slowness. "He prefers his girls young, innocent, and completely untrained. He considers himself something of an educator." My stomach dropped. Even at 8 years old, I understood the implications of what she was saying. This man, this doctor, specialized in children. He was coming here to hurt me, and everyone in this house knew it. "Now, Eleanor," Vivian's voice took on that sickeningly sweet tone she used when delivering the worst news. "Dr. Blackwood isn't technically a customer yet. Today is more of an audition. He wants to meet you, see if you're suitable for his particular needs." "What if I'm not suitable?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Vivian laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, sweetheart. Girls are always suitable for something, if not one thing, then another. The doctor just happens to pay very well for exactly what you have to offer." An hour later, the sound of an expensive automobile pulling up outside sent Vivian into a flurry of last-minute preparations. She checked my appearance one final time, straightening my dress, pinching my cheeks to give them color, and brushing my hair until it shone. "Remember," she hissed in my ear, "be polite, be sweet, and do exactly what he tells you to do. Your future here depends on making a good impression." The front door opened, and I heard voices in the parlor. Vivian's false cheerfulness and a man's voice, cultured and smooth, with the kind of accent that spoke of education and privilege. When they entered the kitchen, I got my first look at Dr. Cornelius Blackwood. He was a man in his 50s, tall and distinguished-looking, with silver hair neatly combed back and expensive clothes that marked him as someone of importance in respectable society. He carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted, when he wanted it. But it was his eyes that made my skin crawl. They were pale gray, almost colorless, and when they fixed on me, I felt like a specimen under a microscope. There was intelligence there, and calculation, but no warmth whatsoever, no humanity. "So this is the little angel I've heard so much about," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "Stand up, child. Let me have a proper look at you." I stood on trembling legs, fighting every instinct that told me to run. There was nowhere to run to anyway. Vivian stood blocking the kitchen door, and I could hear other girls moving around upstairs. Even if I could escape this room, I was trapped in this house, in this city, in this life that had been chosen for me. Dr. Blackwood circled me slowly, examining me from every angle like Vivian had done, but his assessment felt different. More clinical, more predatory. He asked me to turn around, to walk a few steps, to smile. Each request felt like a violation, even though he hadn't touched me yet. "Excellent bone structure," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "Good. Muscle tone, and those eyes, quite remarkable, blue as a summer sky." He reached out and tilted my chin up with one manicured finger, studying my face with scientific detachment. "Tell me, child, how old are you exactly?" 8, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Perfect, he breathed. And the satisfaction in his voice made me want to vomit. And I assume she's completely inexperienced? Pure as the driven snow, Vivian confirmed. Just arrived 2 days ago from a farm family in the middle of nowhere. You'd be her first teacher. The way she said the word teacher made it sound obscene. Dr. Blackwood smiled, an expression that never reached his cold eyes. Wonderful. I do so enjoy working with completely fresh material. There's something special about being the one to shape a young mind. They continued talking about me as if I weren't there, discussing terms and arrangements and schedules like I was a piece of property being leased. Dr. Blackwood wanted exclusive access for the first month, he said. He had specific educational plans that required time and privacy to implement properly. Of course, Vivian agreed readily. For the right price, she's yours exclusively. I assume we're talking about the usual rate for premium service? Double the usual rate, Dr. Blackwood corrected. I'm willing to pay a premium for quality merchandise. Premium merchandise. That's what I had become, a luxury item for sale to the highest bidder. Now then, Dr. Blackwood turned his attention back to me. I'd like to have a little chat with our young lady, privately. Vivian hesitated for just a moment, then nodded. Of course. I'll be right outside if you need anything. When we were alone, Dr. Blackwood pulled out a chair and sat down so he was at my eye level. Up close, I could smell his expensive cologne and see the gold wedding ring on his finger. Somewhere out there, he had a wife who probably thought he was a respectable professional man. Maybe he even had children of his own. Don't be frightened, Eleanor, he said, his voice taking on what he probably thought was a kindly tone. I'm not going to hurt you. In fact, I'm going to help you learn some very important things about life. I want to go home, I said suddenly, the words bursting out before I could stop them. His expression didn't change, but something flickered behind those pale eyes. I'm afraid that's not possible, my dear. Your father sold you to these people because he needed money more than he needed you. That's simply the reality of your situation. The casual cruelty of his words hit me like a physical blow. He wasn't just stating facts. He was enjoying the pain they caused. But I can make your new life much more pleasant, he continued. If you're a good student and learn quickly, I can arrange for you to have special privileges. Better food, prettier clothes, perhaps even some small luxuries. What kind of learning? I asked, though I was terrified of the answer. Dr. Blackwood smiled again, and this time there was genuine anticipation in his expression. Oh, all sorts of fascinating subjects. Anatomy, for instance. The human body has so many interesting features that most children never get to explore properly. The way he said explore made my stomach turn. Even at 8, I knew he wasn't talking about medical textbooks. I also enjoyed teaching young ladies about obedience, he continued. It's such an important virtue, don't you think? Learning to do exactly what you're told, when you're told, without question or hesitation. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small wrapped candy. Here's a little gift to show you that I can be very generous to students who please me. I stared at the candy without taking it. Everything about this man screamed danger, from his cold eyes to his soft voice, to the way he talked about teaching me things that sounded like torture. Take it, he said, his voice hardening slightly. When someone offers you a gift, Eleanor, the polite response is to accept it gracefully. With shaking hands, I reached out and took the candy. It felt heavier than it should have, like it was made of lead instead of sugar. Good girl, he said, his voice warm with approval that made my skin crawl. You see? You're already learning. Now, unwrap it and eat it. I fumbled with the wrapper, my fingers clumsy with fear. The candy inside was bright red, like a drop of blood. When I put it in my mouth, it tasted sickeningly sweet, with a strange underlying flavor I couldn't identify. Excellent, Dr. Blackwood said, watching me chew with intense interest. That wasn't so difficult, was it? The first lesson is always the hardest. Within minutes, I began to feel strange. The room seemed to shimmer around the edges, and my thoughts felt thick and sluggish, like trying to think through molasses. My eyelids grew heavy, and I had to grip the edge of the table to keep from falling over. "What did you give me?" I slurred, panic cutting through the growing fog in my brain. "Just a little something to help you relax," Dr. Blackwood said, his voice now seeming to come from very far away. "Don't fight it, Eleanor. This will be much easier if you just let it happen." I tried to stand up, tried to call for help, but my body wouldn't obey me. The drug, whatever he had given me, was stealing my ability to resist, to fight, to do anything but sit there helplessly while he smiled his cold, predatory smile. "Perfect," he murmured, pulling his chair closer to mine. "Now we can begin your real education." But even as the drug clouded my thoughts and weakened my body, something deep inside me remained untouched. A core of pure fury that no chemical could dissolve, no manipulation could reach. Dr. Blackwood thought he was teaching me obedience, but what he was really teaching me was hatred. And hatred, I was beginning to discover, could be a very powerful teacher indeed. As consciousness slipped away from me in that kitchen chair, I made another promise to myself, a promise that would sustain me through whatever horrors were about to unfold. Dr. Cornelius Blackwood thought he was about to destroy an innocent little girl from Alabama. He had no idea he was creating something far more dangerous than he could possibly imagine. The last thing I remembered before the darkness took me completely was the sound of his voice, soft and cultured, and utterly evil, saying, "Lesson 1 begins now, my dear Eleanor, and I have so very much to teach you." When I woke up hours later, I was no longer in the kitchen. I was in a different room entirely, one I had never seen before, with no windows and only one door. The walls were covered in strange equipment and instruments that I didn't recognize, but somehow knew were meant to cause pain. And Dr. Blackwood was there, waiting for me with infinite patience and that same cold smile. "Welcome to your classroom, Eleanor," he said softly. "Your real education is about to begin." The room where I awakened was like something from a nightmare. The walls were lined with metal cabinets filled with instruments I didn't recognize. Some looked medical. Others appeared designed for purposes I couldn't fathom but instinctively feared. A single electric bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows that made everything look distorted and menacing. Dr. Blackwood stood near, a small table, arranging various items with the methodical precision of a surgeon preparing for an operation. He had changed from his expensive suit into what looked like a doctor's coat, though I doubted any legitimate medical practice would have taken place in this windowless basement room. "Ah, you're awake," he said without turning around. "Good. The sedative was calibrated perfectly, enough to keep you manageable during transport, but not so much as to interfere with our session." My head felt like it was stuffed with cotton, and when I tried to move, I discovered my wrists were secured to the arms of the chair I was sitting in, not with ropes or chains, but with what looked like medical restraints, the kind used in hospitals, to keep patients from hurting themselves. "Don't struggle, Eleanor," Dr. Blackwood advised, finally turning to face me. "The restraints are quite secure, and fighting them will only cause you unnecessary discomfort." "Where am I?" I managed to ask, my voice hoarse and weak. "You're in my private study," he replied, as if this were a perfectly normal conversation. I maintain several such rooms throughout the city for my research. This particular location is completely soundproof and quite private. The implication was clear. No one would hear me scream. No one would come to help me. I was completely at his mercy in this underground chamber. But as I sat there, still groggy from whatever drug he had given me, something unexpected happened. Instead of the overwhelming fear I had felt upstairs, a different emotion began to take hold. The rage that had been building inside me since I arrived at Magnolia House suddenly blazed hotter than ever before. This man, this monster in a doctor's coat, thought he could break me like he had probably broken countless other children. He thought I was just another victim to be used and discarded. But as I looked around that terrible room, I realized something important. I was still me. The drug had weakened my body, but it hadn't touched the core of who I was. Now then, Dr. Blackwood said, pulling up a chair to sit directly in front of me, let's begin with some basic education about your new reality. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a leather journal, opening it to a page covered with neat handwriting. I keep detailed records of all my students, he explained. Their progress, their responses to various teaching methods, their eventual outcomes. He showed me the page, and my blood ran cold as I realized what I was looking at. It was a list of names, all girls' names, with ages ranging from 6 to 12. Next to each name were notes written in his precise handwriting. Resistant initially, responded well to conditioning. Required intensive correction, now fully compliant. Unsuitable for long-term training, terminated. Terminated. The word hit me like a physical blow. Some of these children, these babies, had been murdered when they proved too difficult to break. As you can see, Dr. Blackwood continued, apparently enjoying my reaction. I have extensive experience in this field. I've been conducting these educational experiments for over 20 years now. 20 years. Hundreds of children. And no one had ever stopped him. The key to successful training, he went on, closing the journal and setting it aside, is understanding that resistance is natural but ultimately futile. Every child fights at first. It's human nature. But with the proper application of psychology and pharmacology, even the most stubborn student can be taught to embrace their new role. He stood up and walked to one of the metal cabinets, withdrawing a small glass vial filled with clear liquid. This, for instance, is a remarkable compound. A small injection, and the subject becomes incredibly suggestible. The effects last for several hours, during which time one can implant ideas, suggestions, even false memories. False memories. The full horror of his methods was becoming clear. He didn't just abuse children, he rewired their minds, making them believe they wanted the abuse, even that they had asked for it. But before we begin any chemical interventions, Dr. Blackwood said, returning to his chair, I always like to conduct a baseline assessment. I need to understand exactly what I'm working with. He leaned forward, studying my face with scientific intensity. Tell me, Eleanor, what do you remember about your family? Your father specifically? The question caught me off guard. I remember him working at the lumber mill, coming home tired, reading his newspaper. And do you remember him selling you? Dr. Blackwood asked, his voice gentle but relentless. Do you remember him counting out the money Harold brought him? The money he received in exchange for his own daughter? The words were like knives, each one finding its mark with surgical precision. He was trying to destroy my love for my family, to make me believe that no one had ever really cared about me. He didn't want to, I said, my voice barely a whisper. He needed the money. We were going to lose our house. Dr. Blackwood smiled, clearly pleased with my response. Ah, you're still making excuses for him. How touching. But tell me, Eleanor, if your father truly loved you, wouldn't he have found another way? Wouldn't any real father have chosen to lose his house rather than sell his child to strangers? The question hung in the air like poison gas. Part of me wanted to defend Daddy, to insist that he had no choice. But another part, a growing part, wondered if Dr. Blackwood might be right. Would a father who truly loved his daughter ever make such a choice? I can see the doubt in your eyes, Dr. Blackwood observed with satisfaction. Good. Doubt is the beginning of wisdom. Your father sold you because you were worth more to him as currency than as a daughter. Harold facilitated the transaction because there was profit in it. Even your mother watched you leave without trying to stop it. Each word was calculated to hurt, to break down my defenses and leave me vulnerable to his manipulation. But instead of crushing my spirit, his cruelty was having the opposite effect. With each cruel truth he spoke, my anger burned brighter. And now, he continued, you belong to people who understand your true value, not as a beloved child, but as a commodity, a source of income and pleasure for those who can afford to purchase such things. He reached out and touched my cheek with one finger, a gesture that would have seemed tender if not for the cold calculation in his eyes. But I'm going to help you understand that this isn't necessarily a tragedy. Many of my former students have come to appreciate their new lives. Some even thrive in this environment. What happened to them? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Oh, various outcomes, Dr. Blackwood replied casually. Some are still working in establishments like Magnolia House. Others have been purchased by private collectors who prefer to keep their investments close at hand. A few have proven so exceptional that they've been promoted to management positions, helping to train the next generation of workers. The idea that some of these abused children had grown up to become abusers themselves was almost too horrible to contemplate. But it explained how a system like this could continue to function year after year. The point is, Dr. Blackwood continued, there are many paths your future could take. The one you end up on depends largely on how quickly you learn to embrace your circumstances. He stood up again and walked to another cabinet, this one filled with medical instruments that looked like they belonged in a torture chamber rather than a doctor's office. Now, shall we begin your first practical lesson? But as he turned his back to me, something unexpected happened. The drug he had given me was wearing off more quickly than he had anticipated, and I could feel strength returning to my limbs. More importantly, I noticed something he had missed in his arrogance. One of the restraints on my left wrist hadn't been secured properly. Working carefully, trying not to let my movements show, I began to work my hand free. The leather was tight, but my wrist was small, and after several agonizing minutes, I managed to slip it through the restraint. Dr. Blackwood was still examining his instruments, muttering to himself about which ones would be most appropriate for a first session. His back was turned, and he was completely absorbed in his preparations. This was my chance. It might be my only chance. Moving as quietly as I could, I used my free hand to loosen the restraint on my right wrist. The buckle was stiff, but desperation gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. When both hands were free, I began working on the straps around my ankles. Now then, Dr. Blackwood said, turning back toward me with a steel instrument in his hand. Let's see how well you respond to... He stopped mid-sentence when he saw that I was no longer restrained. For just a moment, surprise flickered across his features. And in that moment of hesitation, I struck. I had never hit another person in my life, but rage and terror combined to give me a strength that shocked us both. I lunged forward, driving my small fist toward his face with every ounce of power I could muster. The blow caught him squarely in the nose, and I heard the sickening crunch of cartilage breaking. Blood immediately began streaming down his face, and he staggered backward, dropping the instrument he had been holding. "You little..." he began, but I was already moving. The room had only one door, and I knew I had seconds at most before he recovered from his shock and came after me. I ran for the exit, my bare feet slapping against the cold concrete floor. The door wasn't locked. Apparently, Dr. Blackwood had been so confident in his chemical restraints that he hadn't bothered with additional security measures. I burst through it and found myself in a narrow corridor lined with other doors. How many rooms like the one I had just escaped were hidden down here? How many other children were trapped behind those doors? But I couldn't think about that now. I could hear Dr. Blackwood behind me, cursing and stumbling as he tried to follow. I had to get out of this underground maze before he caught me. The corridor seemed to stretch forever, but finally I saw a staircase leading upward. I took the steps 2 at a time, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. At the top of the stairs was another door, and beyond that, blessed sight, actual daylight. I was no longer in Magnolia House. Dr. Blackwood had transported me somewhere else entirely while I was unconscious. I found myself in what looked like an abandoned warehouse, with broken windows and debris scattered across the floor. Through the gaps in the walls, I could see the Montgomery skyline in the distance. Behind me, I could hear footsteps on the stairs. Dr. Blackwood was coming, and he was angry. But I had something now that I hadn't had before. Hope. I had escaped his nightmare chamber. I had fought back and won, at least temporarily. And most importantly, I had proven to myself that I wasn't just a victim waiting to be broken. I was a survivor. And survivors don't give up. As I ran through the abandoned warehouse toward what I hoped was freedom, I could hear Dr. Blackwood shouting behind me. But his voice was growing fainter, and with each step I took toward the outside world, I felt a little more of my strength returning. I didn't know where I was going or how I would survive on the streets of Montgomery. I didn't know if Vivian's people would find me or if Dr. Blackwood would track me down. But I knew one thing for certain. I would never again willingly put myself at the mercy of monsters who thought children were property to be bought and sold. The real fight for my freedom was just beginning. The October air hit my skin like ice water as I burst through the warehouse's broken exit door. I was still wearing only that thin white dress Dr. Blackwood had chosen for me, and my bare feet immediately began to sting against the rough pavement. But the cold was nothing compared to the burning determination that drove me forward, away, from that underground chamber of horrors. I found myself in an industrial part of Montgomery I had never seen before, a maze of abandoned buildings, rusted machinery, and empty lots filled with weeds and debris. Smokestacks from active factories in the distance belched dark clouds into the gray sky, and the air tasted of coal dust and chemicals. This was a part of the city where people minded their own business and asked no questions. Behind me, I could hear Dr. Blackwood's voice echoing from inside the warehouse, shouting orders to someone. My blood froze as I realized he wasn't alone. There were other voices responding to his commands. How many people were part of his operation? How far did this network of monsters extend? I ducked behind a pile of rusted metal drums and tried to think. I was 8 years old, alone in a strange city, with no money, no shoes, and no idea where to go. Vivian's people would be looking for me soon, if they weren't already. Dr. Blackwood certainly wouldn't give up easily. I had not only escaped but had the audacity to strike him. In his twisted mind, that probably made me a prize worth pursuing. But I also knew something that gave me a sliver of hope. I was small and fast, and I knew how to hide. Growing up on a farm had taught me to move quietly, to find shelter in unlikely places, and to survive on very little. These skills might just keep me alive long enough to figure out what to do next. The sound of car engines starting up in the distance told me that the search was beginning in earnest. I needed to move, and fast. Staying low, I began making my way through the industrial district, using abandoned buildings and piles of scrap metal as cover. As I moved, my mind raced with possibilities. Going to the police seemed like the obvious choice, but Dr. Blackwood's confidence suggested he had protection in high places. A man who could operate torture chambers in the middle of a city didn't do so without connections. And Vivian had mentioned having friends who would be unhappy if girls went missing. That sounded like official protection to me. Going home to Millbrook Hollow was impossible. Even if I could somehow make the journey, what awaited me there? A father who had sold me once might well sell me again, especially if these monsters offered him more money. And how could I face Mama, knowing what I now knew about the world? How could I tell her what had been done to me in just a few days? As the sun began to set, painting the smoky sky in shades of orange and red, I realized I needed immediate shelter. The October nights in Alabama were getting cold, and I wouldn't survive long in just a thin dress. I also needed food, my stomach. was cramping with hunger, and I hadn't eaten anything since that drugged breakfast with Dr. Blackwood. It was then that I spotted something that made my heart leap with hope. A small Negro church wedged between two abandoned warehouses. The building was old and humble, with peeling white paint and a simple wooden cross above the door, but warm yellow light spilled from its windows, and I could hear the sound of voices singing inside. I knew that approaching any building was a risk, and for all I knew, Dr. Blackwood's network included people in this neighborhood. But churches were supposed to be sanctuaries, places where even the most desperate could find help. And I was certainly desperate. Gathering my courage, I crept closer to the building. Through a side window, I could see maybe 30 people inside, mostly women and elderly men, singing hymns with a passion and joy that reminded me of happier times at Millbrook Baptist. The congregation was entirely colored folks, which in 1950s Alabama meant they understood something about being powerless, about being preyed upon by those with more money and influence. I waited until the service ended and people began filing out, then approached an elderly woman who was walking slowly toward the street. She was tiny, probably in her 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Excuse me, ma'am," I said quietly, stepping out of the shadows. She turned and gasped when she saw me, a white child, alone, barefoot and obviously in distress. In the segregated South of 1950, this was an unusual and potentially dangerous situation for both of us. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, looking around quickly to make sure no one else had seen us talking. "Child, what are you doing out here? Alone? Where are your people?" "Please," I said, desperation making my voice crack. "I need help. Bad people are looking for me. I escaped from them, but I don't have anywhere to go." The woman, I would later learn her name was Esther Washington, looked at me for a long moment. I could see her weighing the risks of helping a white child against her Christian duty to aid someone in need. "What kind of bad people?" she asked quietly. I struggled to find words that would convey the horror without sounding completely unbelievable. "Men who hurt children, who buy and sell them. I was taken from my family and brought to a place where they were going to make me do terrible things." Recognition flickered in her eyes. Apparently, even in the colored community, there were whispers about such things happening in Montgomery. "Come with me," she said finally, making what I now realize was an incredibly brave decision. "But we got to be careful. Can't have folks seeing me with you. That would bring trouble for all of us." She led me through a series of back alleys and side streets, moving with surprising speed for someone her age. We ended up at a small shotgun house in what was clearly the colored section of town, a neighborhood where a white child would definitely stand out. "Wait here," she instructed, leaving me hidden behind a tool shed in her backyard while she went inside. A few minutes later, she returned with a bundle of clothes and a plate of food. "These belonged to my granddaughter before she passed," she said, handing me the clothes. "They should fit you well enough. And here's some cornbread and beans. I know you must be hungry." The food was simple but delicious, and I wolfed it down while Mrs. Washington kept watch for any signs that we had been followed. The clothes were worn but clean, a simple brown dress and a pair of shoes that were only slightly too big. "Now then," she said when I had finished eating, "you need to tell me the truth about what happened to you. All of it. I can't help you proper unless I know what we're dealing with." So I told her everything. About Harold's visits to our house, about Daddy's desperation for money, about the sale and the trip to Magnolia House. I told her about Vivian and the other girls, about the training and the rules and the threats. I even told her about Dr. Blackwood and his underground chamber, though I couldn't bring myself to describe everything I had seen in that terrible room. Mrs. Washington listened without interruption, her face growing darker with each detail. When I finished, she sat in silence for several minutes, apparently processing what she had heard. "Child," she said finally, "you done escaped from something worse than most folks can imagine. But you still in terrible danger. the kind of people you describing. They got long arms and deep pockets. They won't stop looking for you. I know, I replied, but I can't go back there. I'd rather die than go back. And you can't go home neither, she continued. If your daddy sold you once? She didn't need to finish the sentence. We both knew that returning to Millbrook Hollow would likely result in me being handed back to my captors, probably for an even higher price. So what do? I asked, feeling overwhelmed by the impossibility of my situation. Mrs. Washington was quiet for another long moment, then seemed to reach a decision. There's a railroad runs through here, she said quietly. Not the kind with engines and cars, if you understand my meaning. I didn't understand, and my confusion must have shown on my face. The Underground Railroad, she explained. Network of folks who help people get to safety when they can't get there on their own. Most folks think it was just for runaway slaves before the war, but it's still running for those who need it. My heart began to race with new hope. You mean there are people who could help me get away from here? Maybe, she said carefully. But it's dangerous for everyone involved. And once you go down that road, there's no turning back. You'd have to leave everything behind. Your name, your family, your old life. You'd have to become someone else entirely. The choice seemed obvious to me. What did I have to lose? My family had already abandoned me. My old life was already destroyed. The only question was whether I wanted to try to build a new one or surrender to the monsters who thought they owned me. I want to try, I said firmly. I want to be free. Mrs. Washington studied my face in the dim light from her kitchen window. You're young to be making such a decision, she said, but I reckon you've already seen more of the world's evil than most folks see in a lifetime. She stood up and walked to the edge of her yard, scanning the shadows for any sign of watchers. If you're sure about this, I can make some inquiries, but it'll take time to arrange and you can't stay here. Too dangerous for both of us. Where can I go? There's an abandoned cotton mill about 2 miles north of here, she said. Been closed for 5 years now, but the building's still sound. You could hide there for a few days while I try to make contact with the right people. She gave me detailed directions to the mill, along with a small bundle of food and a worn blanket. You be careful, child, she warned. Move only at night, stay hidden during the day, and don't trust nobody unless they give you the right signal. What? Signal? If someone approaches you and says, the river runs deep tonight, you answer, but the current runs true. That means they're safe. As I prepared to leave Mrs. Washington's backyard, she caught my arm gently. What's your real name, child? Eleanor Davidson, I replied. She shook her head. Not anymore. That girl's gone now. Has to be, for your own safety. You need to start thinking of yourself as someone else entirely. It was a strange feeling, letting go of my name, my identity, everything I had been. But Mrs. Washington was, right? Eleanor Davidson was a victim, a piece of property that had been bought and sold. Whoever I became next would be free. What should I call myself? I asked. That's for you to decide, she replied. Choose a name that gives you strength. Choose a name that reminds you who you want to be, not who you were. As I made my way through the dark streets toward the abandoned cotton mill, I thought about names. Names had power. They shaped how you saw yourself and how others saw you. I needed a name that would remind me that I was a survivor, not a victim. By the time I reached the mill and found a hiding place in its shadowy interior, I had made my decision. Eleanor Davidson had died in Dr. Blackwood's chamber. The girl who emerged from that warehouse was someone new, someone stronger, someone who would never again allow herself to be bought, sold, or broken, someone who would fight for her freedom with every breath in her body. 3 days passed in that abandoned cotton mill before Mrs. Washington's contact finally arrived. I had been surviving on the food she'd given me and water I collected from a leaky pipe. sleeping fitfully among the old machinery and trying to stay hidden whenever I heard voices outside. Every shadow seemed to hide danger. Every sound made me think Vivian's people or Dr. Blackwood had found me. On the fourth night, as rain drummed against the broken windows, I heard footsteps approaching my hiding spot behind a massive rusted loom. My heart hammered as a figure emerged from the darkness, a tall Negro man in his 40s, wearing work clothes and a hat pulled low over his eyes. "The river runs deep tonight," he said quietly. "But the current runs true," I whispered back, remembering Mrs. Washington's words. The man smiled, the first genuinely kind expression I'd seen from an adult since leaving home. "My name's Samuel Brooks. Mrs. Washington sent me. You ready to take a journey, little sister?" Over the next 2 hours, Samuel explained the plan. The Underground Railroad still operated in 1950, helping not just runaway slaves as it had before the Civil War, but anyone who needed to disappear from dangerous situations. They had safe houses stretching from Alabama all the way to Canada, staffed by people who risked their own lives to help others find freedom. "It won't be easy," Samuel warned. "You'll travel mostly at night, in hidden compartments of wagons or trains. Sometimes you'll walk for miles through forests and swamps. You might have to stay hidden for days at a time. And once you reach the end of the line, you can never come back." I thought of Mama and little Ruth, probably wondering where I was, maybe even missing me. But I also thought of Dr. Blackwood's journal, filled with the names of children who had disappeared forever into his network of horror. Going back meant becoming just another name in that book. "I'm ready," I told Samuel. The journey north began that very night. Samuel led me through back roads and forest paths to a farm 15 miles outside Montgomery, where a family of white abolitionists, yes, they still existed in 1950, had been running a safe house for decades. The Hartwell family asked no questions about my past, only fed me a hot meal and provided clean clothes that would help me blend in better. From there, I was passed from station to station like a package being carefully delivered. A colored minister in Birmingham hid me in his church basement for 3 days while my pursuers searched the city. A white woman in Tennessee, a schoolteacher named Miss Caroline, taught me to speak with a different accent and gave me books to read so I could pass for an educated orphan from a good family. Each stop along the railroad taught me something new about survival, about the network of brave people who risked everything to help strangers. But more importantly, each mile I traveled away from Alabama helped me become stronger, more confident in my new identity. By the time I reached Ohio, I had chosen my new name, Emma Rose Carter. Emma for strength, Rose for the beauty I was determined to find in life again, and Carter because it sounded like someone who could make her own way in the world. The family who took me in, the Millers of Cleveland, were factory workers who had lost their own daughter to tuberculosis and wanted to help another child in need. They didn't ask too many questions about my past, accepting the story that I was an orphan whose relatives had died in a house fire down south. For 6 months, I lived quietly with the Millers, attending school under my new name and slowly learning to trust again. But I never forgot the promise I had made to myself in that abandoned cotton mill. Someday, somehow, I would make sure that monsters like Dr. Blackwood and Vivian couldn't hurt other children. When I turned 16, I made a decision that surprised everyone who knew me. I joined the Cleveland Police Department as a clerk, then worked my way up to become one of the first female detectives in Ohio. My specialty? Crimes against children. Over the next 40 years, I used my position and my knowledge of how trafficking networks operated to help rescue dozens of children from situations like the one I had escaped. I worked with federal agents to shut down 3 major child trafficking rings, and I personally arrested 2 men who had been customers at places like Magnolia House. I never found Dr. Blackwood or Vivian. They had disappeared shortly after my escape, probably moving their operation to another city when the heat got too intense in Montgomery. But I found others like them, and I made sure they could never hurt children again. The hardest part of my new life was the loneliness. I could never tell anyone the complete truth about my past, which made forming close relationships difficult. I married a good man, Detective Robert Carter, who knew I had secrets but respected my need to keep them. We never had children of our own, though we fostered several young people who needed safe homes. I never returned to Alabama, never saw my family again. That was the price of my freedom, cutting all ties to Eleanor Davidson and everything she represented. Sometimes, late at night, I would wonder about Mama and Ruth, whether they had survived, whether they ever thought about the little girl who had disappeared. But I knew that going back would put them in danger from people who might still be looking for me. It wasn't until I was 65 and safely retired that I learned what had happened to my family. A private investigator I hired discovered that Mama had died of tuberculosis just 2 years after I disappeared, and that Ruth had been sent to live with relatives in Birmingham. My sister, now a grandmother herself, had spent decades wondering what happened to her big sister who vanished one day and never came home. The reunion with Ruth was bittersweet. She remembered me as her protector, the sister who had taken care of her when Mama was sick. She had no idea what Daddy had really done, believing the story that I had run away to find work in the city. I decided to let her keep believing that version of events. Some truths are too painful to share, even with the people we love most. Daddy had died years earlier, taking the secret of what he had done with him to the grave. Harold Brennan had disappeared around the same time I escaped, and no one in Millbrook Hollow seemed to know what had become of him. Now, at 82, I'm finally able to tell this story because all the people who could be hurt by it are gone. The monsters who tried to break me are dead or powerless. The little girl they thought they could buy and sell has become an old woman who has spent her life fighting for justice. But most importantly, I'm telling this story because I want every person watching to understand something crucial. You are stronger than you know. Even when everything seems hopeless, even when the whole world appears to be against you, there is always a choice. You can choose to be a victim, or you can choose to be a survivor. I chose survival. I chose to fight. I chose to build a life that honored the children who didn't escape, who didn't have the chances I had, who became just names in someone's terrible journal. If you're watching this and you're in a situation where someone is hurting you, where you feel trapped and helpless, remember my story. Remember that an 8-year-old girl with nothing but determination and rage escaped from monsters who thought they owned her. Remember that there are good people in this world, people like Mrs. Washington and Samuel Brooks and the Miller family, who will risk everything to help you find freedom. And remember that your past doesn't define your future. Eleanor Davidson was a victim, but Emma Rose Carter became a hero. You can choose who you want to be, no matter what has been done to you. The scars from those few days in 1950 never completely healed. I still have nightmares sometimes, still feel my heart race when I hear certain sounds or smell certain odors. But I also have something that Dr. Blackwood and his kind never understood. I have the knowledge that I am unbreakable. They tried to destroy me, and they failed. That failure gave me the strength to save others. It gave my life meaning and purpose. In a strange way, those monsters who tried to break me actually made me into exactly who I was meant to be. So to anyone out there who feels lost, who feels broken, who thinks they can never recover from what has been done to them, your story isn't over. The strongest steel is forged in the hottest fire. And sometimes, the people who try to destroy us actually give us the tools we need to become unstoppable. My name is Emma Rose Carter. I was born Eleanor Davidson in Millbrook Hollow, Alabama in 1942. I survived hell, and I built heaven from the ashes. And if I can do it, so can you. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.